That's because of CETA.
It's very true. We have many cases, so it's not an kind of common situation.
I think that was also a lot of, it was extremely ambitious, the CETA from the European point of view. It was very important, and but it's not really, it's facilitate for sure the approach and the trade, but it's not doing exactly the work that it was planned to do. So there is a lot of in particular for the public procurement part, because we had this impression, just to say, with the Extra Light project, so the origins of the Extra Light project, and also the other European projects that you supported from the same call from proposals promoted by the European Commission, the Canada, as well as the United States and other countries that were specifically, let's say, recommended to address because of this new bilateral agreement signed, is like to push the clusters and the companies to try to one more time to enter the markets, to approach to the public procurement, because there is not so much success stories behind. And the CETA is very nice. We have analyzed the CETA as clusters of Extra Light, in particular this chapter of the government procurement and support for the European small, medium-sized enterprises. And this is very promising, you know what you read on the paper. And then we studied a bit, the very open sources, the first approach to the public procurement, and then you just crashed in front of the reality. That is not exactly like this. So for sure, it gives us some legal base to keep trying, but it must be some more openness maybe from the Canadian side to accept this, the suppliers from the European Union, maybe, of course, in collaboration with the locals. So to balance a bit and to give the added value to the product, to the service, but also to the local economy and territory. So this is like a general consideration.
But Marta, I've been helping European companies to come to Canada. It's over 15 years now. And I also understand why Canadians are very careful, because what happened, and there is a lot of stories like that, where European companies come to Canada, they start working on a project, the project doesn't go as expected, and they just go back to Europe and they leave whatever they started in Canada, and they just leave it like that. And so now if you're the buyer and you bought, let's say in a hospital, you bought a system, or you're in, well, actually, I'm going to give you an exact example. A company that does some windshield product for the winter, like for your wipers in the winter to clean your windshield. So that company is what they had bought a piece of equipment from Italy. And that piece of equipment was putting some labels on the bottles. So they bought the equipment, everything goes well for 6 months, and then the equipment stopped working. And now they call the Italian company to ask for service, and the Italian company says, oh, well, we've decided that we're not working in Canada anymore, so bye-bye. So now the companies, they bought that piece of equipment, they have that piece of equipment in the plant, but it's not working, and they have nobody to service it and nobody to take care of it. And so I take that example because that's one that I heard of recently, but that happens all the time. And so if you're a buyer and in a public tender especially, and you're buying a product coming from Europe, you better demonstrate to your boss that that was the best product to buy, because if anything happened and then after 6 months there is nobody to service that product and you've used some public money to buy something that end up in the garbage, you're not in a very good position. And for the government, it's a very touchy subject. So I think that's also something European companies have to realize, is that what kind of guarantee do I give that I'm going to be here tomorrow to service and maintain the product I'm selling?
Okay, clear.
So, you know, and that's part of the thing we're going to address a bit later in the presentation. It's how you open, you create a company, or how you put some skin in the game, how we say in English, because put yourself in the shoe of the buyer, right? If you're tomorrow, Marta has to buy a new software coming from a Canadian company, but that Canadian company, then you call them, they are 6 hours different, they never answer your call during the day, you have to call them at night to help you. It's not...
Yeah, this is another, let's say, customer service. It must be thought in a customized way to this, and it must be guaranteed. And I think this is something that ensures also the quality of the product or service, so that you're ensuring also the service and the maintenance.
But so
at least for a period of time, you know, it's...
But you understand that beyond the text of the CETA and everything that politics can write down in a document, then you have the buyer himself who has to commit to buy something that, I don't know, like, you know, we're talking about lighting. Tomorrow, if I buy for 2 million worth of lighting in the streets of Montreal, and they all stop working in the middle of the winter at night because it's too cold, and there is a 5-car accident because people can see, what do I do? So it's a bit more than just the CETA, it's and the public tender. It's how a company can demonstrate that they're here for a long time and they can support what they're selling to you.
No, yeah, exactly. The CETA just opened the door. Let's say they open the doors and say, okay, so you can apply. You are free to take all the opportunities on the public procurement that are on the table. But then, of course, at the federal, provincial, municipal level, there are some restrictions, specific provisions that you need to respect to be eligible, to be, how to say, considered valuable and trustworthy for the service. So this is clear.
And I think at the end of the day, it's for the European company to demonstrate that they can support their product for the long time. So you were mentioning chapter 19, Marta. Here it is, and it's exactly what you said. Requires the Canadian central government and sub-central government to treat you as suppliers of goods and services in an open, transparent, and non-discriminatory manner when they participate in many types of public procurement. So it's exactly what you mentioned. It's exactly what we just talked about. It's here, but we have to go a bit beyond that. That's chapter 19. So here maybe a few points. So all public tenders are not covered by the CETA, and to be covered by the CETA, you need to meet those 3 points. So it has to be covered by a government entity listed in the CETA, and so that's basically all form of government in Canada. I don't think there's many exceptions. There is must meet and exceed specific value thresholds. So we're talking about $25,000 for goods at the federal level, $40,000 for services, and $100,000 when we talk about defense. But then every province has some slightly different thresholds. And then it must not be subject to any of the express exclusions set out in CETA. So There are some exclusion in CETA, and it concerns mainly, I would say, touchy subject related to defense and so on. But not only, and I think I've covered that a bit further, but just to let you know, and to give you a first sense of what we mean here by exclusion set out in CETA, there are some products that are eligible for public tender in Quebec that are not in Nova Scotia, for example. And the reason is because in Nova Scotia, you have, for example, a shipbuilder, and they didn't want to sign the treaty and opening their public tender to shipbuilder coming from Europe. So you have some restriction, and most of the time, I was trying to look into that, but most of the time those restrictions are related to the fact that there is a strong local players that carry a lot of local jobs. And so they've excluded that to put those people in competition through the CETA agreement. I was mentioning before, like at the federal level, what is under the federal government. So as I mentioned, government department and agency, all the crown corporations, so Canada Post, VRL, CBC being the television channel. And some commercial enterprise that are owned by the Canadian government. So CMHC, which is everything related to lodging, Atomic Energy of Canada, and so on and so on. I think, to go back to our discussion, we have also to make a note that CETA is the only agreement the only free trade agreement that Canada has that opens access to a public tender. For example, in the CUSMA with the US, it's a free trade agreement, but there is no access to public tender by US companies. So European companies have definitively an edge and an advantage thanks to CETA on that. Now, to go back to our discussion, the US companies are just next door. They are an hour flight away, 6-hour drive for most of the big cities. So they don't have that same advantage, but they have some different advantage and that are more maybe practical advantages. I'm not sure I had shared that number before, but all municipal government also have tenders that are covered by the CETA, and we have 3,700 municipal government in Canada. So, the first bullet point here, Marta, it's exactly what you said. It should not limit the kind of procurement in which you, supplier, participate. But I don't think you want to waste too much of your time when the tender clearly explains that local content will be favored, because I think you're just going to lose some, waste your energy, unless you're 100% convinced that what you're offering is so much better and so much more innovative and so much cheaper. But otherwise, it will be challenging. So yeah, that's sorry. That slide is all about what you can or cannot access, and typically you can answer to any tender. It's just a matter of then estimating.
Yeah. What do you mean by a non-covered procurement?
So in one of the slides above, I had defined covered procurement as all the procurements that are covered by CETA.
Okay.
So non-covered are the exception, basically.
Okay.
So the one I mentioned in Nova Scotia, where they don't want shipbuilding, things like that.
Okay. Okay.
I find that graph pretty easy to read, and I guess that's the one you need to have in mind. Here are the criteria you need to understand. So it's what we've covered already. Nothing really new here. Yeah, I think yes. One thing I want to add, it's mainly in the first bullet. It's so when we talk about government and we go down in the different level of government, especially at the municipal, at the provincial level, all the school boards, all the hospitals, all the health organization are all part of the municipal government, and therefore all their tenders are covered by the CETA. So it's not just street and infrastructure and so on. It's also schools, hospitals, and therefore hospital beds and I don't know, new furniture in school and so on. As long as you reach the minimum threshold, all those different sub-level or all those different organizations or agencies that are part of the municipal government, or at least are under the municipal authorities, are also open for the tenders. So here are a few exclusions. I talked about the shipbuilding one, and again, when you look at the province where it's excluded, British Columbia, there is some shipbuilding. Manitoba, I'm not too sure because they don't have any waterfront, but it's here as well. But then Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PI, and Quebec are all have a maritime access, and therefore they all have a shipbuilding activity. So it's pretty easy to make the relation between what's excluded with which region of Canada. So you could have a public tender for shipbuilding in Ontario that's covered by CETA, but not in New Brunswick, for example. Okay. Mass transit vehicles in Ontario and Quebec. And again, the reason is very easy to understand. There is a couple of big players in that region, in those two regions, and so on and so on. I'm not going to detail everything, but
there is nothing excluding lighting.
Not that I know of.
Okay.
No, but except if the application is, for example, a military application overseas, or you have lighting everywhere now, so
yeah.
Maybe not lighting directly, but maybe some of the application.
But there is no big lighting lobby in any of the provinces that can hinder this.
Yeah, no, you're right. No, there is not.
Okay.
So starting maybe to introduce the public tender, I just want to for you to understand what happened in Quebec a few years ago, because I think it's very interesting to understand the context of public tender, especially at the municipal level. So there was a commission called the Commission Charbonneau that was put in place to check how the construction construction contracts were awarded, especially in public tenders. And they came to the conclusion that it was really rigged, with a lot of involvement of criminal activities, mafia, and so on. So the reason I mention that is because it has been that commission lasted for over a year, with a ton of interviews with public servants, with construction companies and so on. And they came to the conclusion that it was really, really bad. And so that created some opportunities actually for European companies, because what happened is that there were so many local companies that were involved in that scheme that they started to look at companies from outside of the province of Quebec, just to clean their hands a little bit, because the government said, we can't work with you guys anymore. And so a lot of those companies, what they've done during those times, they've closed, they've reopened under another name. So it's still the same people, it's still the same thing, but they had to close, they had to reopen under another name. But during that time, there were some opportunities. And for example, not Thursday, but on the next, I think the next presentation we have, we're going to have someone coming to present from a French company named De Richebourg, which specialize in waste collection. And those people, they just came in Quebec right at that point, and it allowed them to win a few public contract with the city of Montreal for the collection of waste. And to me, the main reason why they won is because they were really looking at solution coming from outside of the province of Quebec. And happened that, the North American players were already highly involved, and bringing someone from Europe was for them a way to, again, clean their hand and turn out to be a nice opportunity for the company. So I just want to give you a little bit of that context for you to understand where it's coming from, and the fact that public tenders in Quebec especially are very now looked at through some process, and led to the creation of l'Autorité des marchés publics, AMP. So we have Autorité des marchés financiers already, AMF, which is a financial institution that look after to make sure that everything that's happened in Canada in terms of training has been respected, that people who sell some financial services are doing it rightly. But now we have l'Autorité des marchés publics, and l'Autorité des marchés publics has the responsibility to make sure that every bid, public tenders, and companies that are bidding are respecting the law to start with, and the minimum of commitment. So that's what I was, the Autorité des marchés publics, AMP. So you can look into that, but basically they have a big focus on construction, because what I didn't mention is that all that Commission Charbonneau was mainly around construction public tender. So the AMP will check that, as much as possible, they're going to work with local companies that they can control. And so it's, if you're coming from Europe, you need to, if you want to win that type of project, you definitively need to have some type of operation. But in construction, you basically have no choice than to have people locally.
But Ian, the thresholds that we see here are the thresholds above which they must go through the public procurement?
Correct.
Okay. So below, for example, the 5 million for construction contracts of contract, they can go for direct contracting?
Yes, they can go direct contract, yeah.
Okay. And how they are, the direct contracting means that they contact the company that they know and they assign the contract? Or is there any sort of public or partially public search of offers, collection of offers, or invitation to, in Europe, we have some in many countries, there is something like negotiated procedure. So for example, they invite 5 potential contractor suppliers, and then they make this selection of this 5 from this 5.
Yeah, it's exactly the same process.
Okay.
So
Okay.
they will check in advance your ability to meet the requirement of the contract.
Okay.
And then the IMP will make sure that you check all the boxes and that you're a clean company, and then they will invite you to.
And they are picking the suppliers from some database, or just, you know, I know a company, I call them?
No, the companies have to
Register somewhere to become, okay.
register and make themselves known.
Okay, thank you.
You know, the thing is, it's interesting. One of the things that was very interesting that came out is that, you know, if you look at the Quebec market only, when you look at big construction projects, and again, go back into the size of Quebec in terms of number of inhabitants, right? We're talking about 8 million people. So the number of players who are able to do a huge construction project, let's say build a highway, for example, is very little, because you need some huge piece of equipment, and there is not that many companies that have that type of financial means to be able to have that type of equipment. So what happened is that when they did that Commission Charbonneau, and they did, okay, we don't work with all those companies anymore. Well, the next stage was, who's going to be able to do it, because nobody else has the equipment to do so. So that's why they kind of closed, reopened under another name. But at the end of the day, it's pretty much the same players. The only thing is now the IMP is checking on them very closely and trying to make sure that things are clean. But yeah, when we talk about a $5 million project, it's not just a Bobcat or just a bar. You need some serious equipment, and not a lot of people have it. So since I'm in Quebec, just to keep talking about their system. So all the different level of government and all the different provincial government are using some different platform to communicate on their public tenders. So at the federal level, the system is called, and it's very new, they've changed system about maybe 2 or 3 months ago. It's very recent. It's now SAP Ariba, which I believe is pretty well known and used in many places in the world now. But in Quebec, for example, they're using what they call SEAO, which is actually a private company, private platform that but works exclusively at showcasing Quebec public tenders. Now, this being said, those the public tenders that have the status of covered by CETA are, even if they are at the provincial level, you can find them under the federal platform. So there is an agreement for the provincial tenders that are covered by CETA to also be available under the federal platform.
And sorry, and the tenders that are published on the CAO platform of Quebec are also published on the CAP Ariba at the federal level? So
only if so in the definition of the tender, okay, you have something that's called applicable agreements. And if under applicable agreements it says CETA, then it is also available under the federal platform. Now, as we've seen before, some are not under applicable agreement, but you're still allowed by law as a European company to answer. But because they're not referred here as an applicable CETA agreement, then it's not available on SAP Ariba, it's only available on SEAO. Okay. So it's probably better to register for both if you want really to see all the type of tenders. And here to your point, Marta, you have different type of notice in those tenders. Some are call for tenders and some are qualification, and that qualification process is part sometimes of those tenders that are only open to people who have registered in advance and have been qualified as a company being able to answer. So sometimes it's a multi-stage process where first you have to register, qualify, and then you can be invited to a tender.
Okay, and I think on Thursday we'll go deeper in this, just the curiosity. Register with the supplier database. Is it fully accessible to the European companies, or they should go through some, I don't know, recognitions process before they can register as a supplier, or they can just register as a supplier being a European-based company?
Yeah, no, you should be able to register just
Okay.
as a European company.
Okay.
Sorry, that slide should have been before, my mistake, but you know, you were saying that the impact of CETA is not as big as expected, but I just wanted to show that slide to show that since CETA, export and import activity has grown significantly. Well, I've grown a lot, sorry. And I mean, that's not just related to public tender, right? But mostly to the fact that there are duties on goods. So the economic impact of CETA is not negligible. That's just to show how the type of goods and in which proportions they've been exchanged by country. I mean, this, I guess you'll have the time to look after. Yeah, and sorry for that mismatch. Those 3 slides should have been earlier. And sorry, I don't know what happened here. So as I was mentioning, I started with Quebec just to give a little bit of the context and what happened, and that it's a little bit unique with the IMP, but public procurement in general. So again, federal level, they have a website. It's called buyandsell.gc.ca, but behind the platform is SAP Ariba. And then all different provinces and different municipalities are using different platforms. Again, Quebec, SEAO, Ontario, it's called Jagger. The city of Ottawa and the city of Toronto are under SAP Ariba. So a lot of different platforms. From what I understand and what I'm reading, there is now I think I will say the intention of a lot of those different government and agency to migrate toward SAP Ariba. I'm expecting SAP Ariba to be the main platform in the coming years. It seems that a lot of are migrating towards that platform.
What I was let's say exploring, and I have also contacted the some officer, I suppose, in the buy and sell Canada that now is the SAP Ariba. And it was like a couple of months ago, so they were in the full transition process, and there was like huge mess to find some tenders. But what they answered to me is that the final goal, and they have like 2 years. So they said it was like 2 years time to transfer everything on the SAP Ariba, to have one entry point. For
everything
all
everything at the federal level.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But then the provincial and municipalities will still have their own. And I'm telling you that before Quebec, agrees to move on the same platform as everybody else, it's going to take some time.
Yeah, they said that they have this goal of 2 years, but they are doing some, I don't know, bilateral negotiations with the provinces, because they wrote me also that they are trying to convince the municipalities to also publish the tenders. So to have like keep the two platforms, to publish on their own, but also to use this SAP Ariba to reach the wider suppliers.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, those some big municipalities, Toronto and Ottawa, are already under SAP Ariba. So, you know, when the leaders are starting to use a platform, for the other one, it's probably you know, just a time for them to follow and to align. But again, there will always be some black sheep that don't want to be like everybody, and I can put my money on the table that Quebec will be one of them.
Yeah, but then the commission will restart the process of analyzing the procurements.
Yeah, that's very possible indeed. There is also a private platform called Merx. So this one is very interesting because what they try to do is to get all the information from all the different platforms and to put everything under one common platform. So the main difference is that the government platforms are free. Merx, you have to pay for that service. But Merx also have some tenders that are non-public tenders. So you can go a bit beyond just regular public tenders thanks to Merx. So it's an interesting one to consider. I've tried to get people of Merx doing us a presentation about the platform because, you know, to me, it was a great opportunity for them to get exposure with some European stakeholders, and they refuse. They say, no, we don't do any showcasing of our platform to anybody. So it is what it is, but it's unfortunate because I think it would have been interesting to see how they run their platform, but please know it exists. And then there is some international platform, Tenders on Time, for example, where you can find some of the Canadian tenders on it. At the federal level, I mentioned it's $25,000 for the threshold, sorry, to have a public tender. It's $25,000 for goods, $40,000 for services. The federal government and at least Assistant Procurement Canada, what they're trying to do is they're telling all the agency, even if you have a contract at $10,000, you can put it in the system. So 25,000, 40,000, you have to, but under that, you can also find some tenders that are below those two thresholds and that are available on the website. But basically what Procurement Canada is saying is that ultimately you should put all your tenders in that platform, under or not under the threshold, because doing that, you increase your chance to get the best supplier for your goods or services you're looking for. So some agencies are a bit reluctant because, as you understand, it's a little bit more paperwork, but some others at the same time, they say, oh, I'm just going to give that to Procurement Canada and they will deal with it. Yeah, here there is one point that I think people have to be aware of. It's everything related to intellectual property. You have to be very careful when you answer those public procurement to understand if you keep ownership of the intellectual property of the service of good you're providing. That's, you know, that's a real subject because you're exposing yourself when you do that. So you better make sure that you understand where the intellectual property stay with, no, sorry, who the intellectual property stay with? Does it transfer to the buyer, and in that case, the federal government or municipal government, or does it stay with the company that provides the service? So that's sometimes defined in the tender, sometimes it's not. So it's something to be very careful with. There is some horror stories about IP in Canada, and people think Canadians are very nice, so we shouldn't be too careful. But actually, if they see an opportunity, they will take it. And so, if there is an opportunity to, you don't protect your product or service, and they find an opportunity to take it, they will. So again, be very careful with that. We talked a little bit about that already, the standard regulation and certification. Again, you still need to have the Canadian one, even if now the organization that grants the certification will recognize the CE mark in the process. CE mark or other, but just to make it easier, I use the CE mark. But it's not, you cannot use it as is. You still need to go through the process of having the equivalence. Okay. If okay with you, I'll suggest we'll take 5-minute breaks. I just want to refill my water and get some medication.
Okay.
If okay with you, if we can take 5 minutes, is it okay?
Yes,
I
sure.
think yes, too.
We see if you want at 4 o'clock, it's some minutes. So
Okay. So I'm leaving the connection open. I'm just going to
yeah.
do the few things I have to do, and I'll be back before 4, and we can chat and restart at 4. Okay.
Okay. Perfect.
Thank you.
I am Julia.
Okay, I took my drugs. I should be good for another hour.
I'm sorry, you are sick.
But last week, I couldn't even get up from bed. There was no way I could do the presentation. I was so dead. Anyway, so before I start the next section, is there any questions from?
I had one question, but that I think is also the questions of other partners, but I don't know if you will maybe cover it later on. It was that when you were mentioning the certifications and the fact that the European certification like CE are not valid in Canada, and that the companies will have to go through the Canadian certification process or recognition of the European ones. But if they have the certifications or label marks that are recognized in the United States, connecting it to the similarity of these two markets, does the labels or certifications that are recognized in the United States are valid also for Canada?
Depends for what. If we talk about lighting, and therefore I'm guessing we're talking about mainly electrical certification. It's a different certification in Canada. It's a CSA certification, and again, they will recognize to some extent what's done in the US, but it's most likely that you will need to get the actual CSA certification for electrical product.
Okay.
What happened is that in Canada there is that organization named CSA, and they are kind of a weird beast because they are private, public, kind of in the middle. So they have the mandate to pass all those new rules and new certifications, and therefore their business model is based on creating certification and making sure everybody has a certification. So it's almost, especially in the electrical sector, it's almost impossible to go around it. CSA is here, and they're very strong, very powerful, and so they want everything to be certified. So we haven't heard anything from Anna, Alberto, who else is here? Federico, Marisol, Mary, Gerard, Barbara. You guys have any questions, comments?
Yeah, Ian, I like to have a look to the previous slide, if it's possible, just the last one of previous part. Before that, I have a question to the last part on public procurement. For me, it's not clear, as we already have a lot of work looking for tenders in the first part of our project. It's not clear if there's a specific way to cover all the tenders, because we work on a specific platform each province. So we made a description on the 10+3 province and territories, and all the platform are quite clear. We have free inscription. But after we saw that Quebec City, a specific tender, and we try also to make inscription to marks, but I'm not sure that it cover completely all tenders in the Canadian. So if I know we discussed just at the end of the previous part on that, but if you have any special rules to cover as much as possible the tenders in the Canadian market.
Again, as I mentioned, if the tender is covered by CETA, okay, it should be available under the federal platform. Now, some tenders are not qualified or are not tagged as a CETA covered, but it doesn't mean that you cannot answer it. So probably the best way to do it is to have access to different platforms and to have some keywords that try to give you the information. But you know, those keywords, especially in your industry, are not super easy, because when you do lighting construction, you have a lot of different things, and if you just put lighting, you're missing some project. So it's not super easy. I think on Thursday, that's something we can challenge Jonathan on. Is to ask him, you know, what is the best way to get access to as many tender as possible. But if it's not tagged or flagged as CETA covered, and you know, you cannot have an access to all the platform, to all the different municipalities in Canada. So between the municipal, the federal, MERCs, you should have access to most of them. But yeah, I don't know how to guarantee that you have access to 100% of them.
Okay, but finally, federal is different from province. So if we follow all the 13 province, 10+3 territories platform, and the buy and sell platform, we are quite sure to cover all tenders of interest. And as you explained, if we have a CETA tender, for sure we have to find that in buying and selling.
Correct. And I think
And
Alberto,
for sure, for all the products, we have to, yeah, please.
I think Alberto, I will also look at the platform of the largest cities, because the largest cities might have their own platform. As I mentioned before, Toronto and Ottawa are already under SAP Ariba, but some other ones, you know, I don't know all the platform of all the municipalities, but if we're talking about, and I go back to what we were saying before about heritage and the importance of lighting in heritage buildings, you know, it has to be probably the city of Halifax, city of Quebec, city of Montreal, city of Toronto. You know, you also have to look at the cities that are the most likely to carry that type of tender and probably add them into your scope of tenders you're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I don't see another question at the moment in the chat.
Sorry, Antonella, we can't hear you.
I don't see other questions in the chat, so. we can
Okay.
carry on.
So I'll move on to doing business. So we've talked so far about the presentation of the Canadian environment, an introduction to public procurement. But I think what was very interesting is the discussion we had with Marta before about, okay, but once you've identified a tender, have you answered the tender, what's next? So that's what I'm going to try to cover here, just to explain that, you know, answering a tender, I don't think is enough to be able to do business in Canada. There is much more beyond it. And that's what my intention is to cover now. So first of all, creating a business in Canada. So what you have to understand is you can create a business at two levels. Again, either you can create your business at the federal level or you can create it at the provincial level. There is no advantages really to create a business at the federal level, except if you work in the defense military, but even that it's not that much of an advantage. It just allows you to work in all the provinces without recreating some different offices. But the thing is, there is a big constraint is that you need to have at least 25% of your directors that are Canadian resident. So to make it easy, I will forget about incorporating a company at the federal level, and I will focus on incorporating a company at the provincial level. And why? Because there are some provinces, and especially Quebec, Ontario, and BC. In those provinces, you can incorporate a 100% European-owned subsidiary with no administrator who are residents of Canada. Okay, meaning that I'm a company based in Germany and I want to open a subsidiary in Canada and I do it through Quebec or Ontario. It can be 100% owned by the headquarters in Germany, and I don't need to have any fiscal resident on my board. Okay, so that's probably the easiest way to do it. And then the whole process of creating a company or a subsidiary in Canada is fairly easy. So we're just talking about a few weeks and a few $1,000s for the process, administrative process, and having a lawyer that take care of the paperwork. But it's a very easy process. What is a little bit more complicated, and actually which is probably the most complicated part in that whole process, is to open a bank account. Because to open a bank account, typically you will need to come here in person to be able to open the bank account and sign the paperwork. The reason why they're doing that is because they want to limit any activity of money laundering. And so they don't want to have people who create companies in Canada and actually that company does not really exist, or the people behind it, nobody knows who they are. So that's probably the most difficult part of the process. But for the rest, it's very easy. You can get your company being an address that can be with your lawyer, that can be with your accounting firm, that can be with people like us. So that's very easy. And then the other thing you need to do is to get your tax numbers. But overall, keep in mind that creating a company in Canada is very easy. The other thing that can be a little different from Europe is that there is absolutely no obligation for Canadian company to advertise on their financial statements, except, of course, if you are traded on the market. But if you're not a publicly traded company, you don't need to advertise on your financial statement. So it is a challenge sometimes for European companies who want to develop a partnership with a local company and they want to know a little bit more who they are, what is their financial state, are they who they say they are they as big as they're pretending. You don't have any access to that information publicly. The only way you can do it really is to ask that company to send you their audited financial statements. In terms of capital, I'm sorry because I don't know in all the European countries, but I know in France, for example, companies use their capital as sometimes as a way to show their muscles. You know, you say, okay, my company has a €1 million capital. It's sometimes a way in a commercial relation to show that you have a strong company. Really, in Canada, because you don't need to advertise on your financial statement, a lot of companies, unless you need it for operational purposes, but a lot of companies just start the business with a $1 capital, and you don't need more than that. So it's very easy to create a subsidiary from Europe and just to start it with a capital of $1. Nobody ever is going to ask you why, how, because they won't know.
But this regards, Ian, only the private company. So this kind of documentation, like the financial statements to prove that you exist, that you're not bankrupt, that there is some people behind, can be requested by the public buyers during the tendering process. Or also they do not have this power to request this kind of documentation.
Well, they can always no. Well. The public authorities, they have access to your information, want it or not, because they can go back and see your tax declaration. So,
but only if you are registered in Canada.
Correct, and that's what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about creating a subsidiary in Canada. Yeah. So,
but they will never, if they will by case consider in the public tendering the European-based company, might they have asked the European company to provide the financial statements? Or it's not the case? Because in Europe, in most countries, we used to, if I'm not wrong. It means this is the part of this administrative eligibility requirements. So many public authorities at the governmental or regional, whatever levels, very often they ask from the bidders also to provide the financial statements from the last, I don't know, 3 to 5 years to prove that they have stable financial condition. and the companies usually are
Yeah.
used to it
Is-
and they're obliged.
Yeah,
But
it's a from France. I confirm you're right. You can be asked for the statement during the last years and
Yeah.
to prove that you are existing, you made profit in the past years. And
Yeah.
it's very important to give confidences to your partners. It's very important. Many times it's a strong requirement from the public authorities.
Exactly.
That's true.
So my question was, for the public authorities in Canada, is this also important to verify if the bidders are financially viable and are financially sustainable?
So I don't recall it being asked, but at the same time, we're talking about projects that were not millions of dollars. But I'm sure, I mean, if part of the process is to ask for it, they will for sure. They won't refrain from asking. We can confirm that with Jonathan on Thursday. I don't have a perfect answer for that. Sorry.
No, it could be quite important also if this is a part also of, I don't know, administrative checks that are made by the public buyers, because as you mentioned at the beginning, that all documentation must be also produced in 2 languages. So if we have the European company coming from Poland or Italy, that usually this kind of documentation are in Italian or in Polish or whatever. This is also the documentation that needs to be, let's say, prepared, translated, and I suppose verified legally. I don't think that friendly translations are valid in this kind of procedures.
Yeah, you're right. You probably need to show your audited financial statement and that have been translated by the auditor, I'm guessing. But yes, we'll ask on Thursday. I put a note to make sure we address that subject. I don't have a perfect answer for it. So yeah, so to conclude on creating a business, again, fairly easy, fairly quick. There are a few advantages to it. First of all, when you have a business incorporated in Canada, you can use a .ca website, for example, but you need to have a Canadian residency for your company or for yourself to be able to use a .ca website. So, you know, for your different partners, it's reassuring. It's reassuring also for them to know that you register with all the tax numbers, that they can pay you in a bank account here in Canada. So, I mean, because it's easy, it's a process that should be done fairly quickly for companies that have some serious intention to develop in Canada. There is a cost to it, obviously, because every year you need to provide financial statements and to do your tax declaration. But beyond that, it's for a company that's serious about coming in the country, incorporating a subsidiary here, it shouldn't be too much of a hurdle.
And,
So
sorry, one question. And when you have this subsidiary registered in Canada, are you considered of value for the local economy? This is connected to the question that many tenders are preferring the local suppliers or not.
Yes. So yes and no, meaning that it will depend what you actually do with that subsidiary. If that subsidiary is just a mailbox somewhere, they will not consider it as local content. Now, if you have some local operation and you do some work, so if we're talking about, I don't know, some electronic goods and you do some, at least some assembly, or you manage all the installation, or the maintenance with that subsidiaries, and yes, it will be considered to some degree to have some local content. But I mean, just having a mailbox in Canada with a company, it won't be sufficient to qualify as local content. So when you're registering, when you incorporate a company in Canada, you always have the choice either to put it under a name or a number. So there are two different things that are very distinct. There is a name of the company and there is a usage name of the company, meaning that you can incorporate under a number, but then your commercial name and the name you use on a daily basis can be different from that. That's important because in Quebec, you cannot incorporate a company that has an English name that means something. So the name of your company cannot be, for example, Extra Lighting. That will not work. They won't accept that. So in that case, you have to change it, or you have to call it Éclairage Extra Lightning, for example. You need to have the French version inside of it as well. But anyway, when you work with a lawyer, the first thing they do, they submit the name to the register, and they will confirm or not if your name is acceptable. It has to be done in any case to make sure that the name does not already exist. So it's part of the process of incorporating a business. In terms of tax, I just want to go back on that for 1 second, because again, we'll see the difference between federal and provincial. So in Canada, you always have two levels of taxes, the federal taxes, and the federal taxes are called GST, and they are 5%. And sorry, those are the value added sales tax. Sorry. So the GST, it's 5% across the board. So it's 5% on every sale you make in Canada, no matter what is the provinces, except for some First Nation communities that are exempt of tax. But that will be a very, very small minority. And then you have the provincial taxes, and their name and the percentage is different from one province to the next. So if we talk about the extremes, in Alberta, there is 0% tax on VAT at the provincial level because of the lot of money they made thanks to the oil sands. On the other hand, in Quebec, it's in Quebec, it's 15%. No, sorry. Oh, sorry, I have a absolute blank. It must be 12%. Sorry about that. I'll get back to you on the exact number. I think it's 12%, but the way they calculate the tax in Quebec is they take your price, so let's say 100, they add the federal tax, 5%, so it's 105, and they calculate the tax on the price taxed by the federal level. So they add the 12%, I believe, on top of the 105 and not the 101. In other provinces, if you buy a good 100, you pay 5% of tax on the good at the federal level, and whatever is the tax of the province, you pay it on the amount before tax, which makes sense. But in Quebec, they consider that the federal tax should be taxed as well. The other thing that's very important regarding taxes is that in B2B or B2C environment, prices are always, except for very few exceptions, but prices are always before tax. So if you go to a store and you want to buy a pencil, you will see 125, and that's before tax. So by the time you get at the cashier, that pen becomes 150. And so in business, in B2B, you never have the tax included. It's always a price before taxes, and it's understood by everybody. So when you write a contract, you have to make it clear. But I mean, when you have discussion with a partner, when your partner tells you it costs 500, there are taxes to add on top of that. This being said, if you have a structure in Canada, you will be able, as a company, to recoup your taxes. So basically, the impact of tax is very limited. So the obligation to collect and remit the tax fall under the vendor. So every month or every quarter, depending on the amount of tax you collect, you have to remit the tax at the federal and at the provincial level. Maybe one last thing is that there is something called HST. It's harmonized sales tax, and it's used in a few provinces where all the tax are the same. So in Ontario, for example, the HST, it's 5% of the federal plus 8% of the provincial, for a total of 13%. Bank account, I mentioned the fact that that's probably the most challenging part of the process. The applicable laws, that's interesting too, because most of the business are governed by common laws, but in Quebec, and especially in civil issues, it's under Code Civil, which is pretty much the same one as we have in France. And then I had mentioned that earlier, but la Charte de la langue française, which is the charter of the French language. I'm even surprised that they allow us to translate that. The charter of the French language is dictating the rules around language for commerce and business. I mean, I mentioned that example before, but so every notice of utilization, any training, any software has to be available in French. If you look at retail goods, for example, in the food industry, all the packaging must display French and English across Canada. That's a rule, not always applied, but that's the rule. And in Quebec, the size of the font has to be the same size or bigger in French than it is in English on the packaging. So pretty interesting. One of the things also that's very interesting is in the justice system, there are no exemplary sentence like in the US. The sentence are always proportional to the prejudice. So that's a bit reassuring for a company. Let's say you have a lightning pole that falls on a car. Then they're not going to charge you based on exemplary sentence because you didn't do your job properly. They will you will be fined based on the fact that you broke your car, and so that's going to be pretty much limited to the cost of the car and the repairs around it.
Jan,
Yes.
To open the bank account, and I link it to the case if the European company will be assigned of the public tender by case successful winning tendering. Regarding the payments between the public authority and the European company, do they need to have the bank account opened in Canada, so in Canadian dollars, or can they keep their bank account in Europe, considering that it is managed in euro or in most cases?
Well, few elements to that. First of all, you cannot have a bank account in Canada if you don't have a subsidiary. So if you don't have a subsidiary and you win a tender, the public authority will have to pay you on your account in Europe.
Or they can ask you to open the subsidiary in Canada?
Yeah, they can always. That can always be a request. Can be always be a requirement part of the tender. But if it's not part of the tender, you cannot have a bank account in Canada if you don't have a subsidiary. So
yeah, exactly.
So
but this
so
can be.
They will pay you with an international transfer. Now, this being said, the tender will be in Canadian dollar, and I don't expect the Canadian government to take the risk of exchange. So the European company will have to make the invoice in Canadian dollars, and then when the money gets to their accounts, they will get the exchange rate of the day. Now there are some ways to protect yourself for that. You buy some, you work with your bank on getting some protection on your exchange rate. But I think, you know, that's one of the first thing you have to do when you do international business is to invoice your client in their money. It's just part of being a good supplier.
Yeah. This is clear mainly between B2B. So they make some agreements bilateral. I was wondering if the federal or provincial authority can see the fact that the European company doesn't have the account in Canadian dollars, or doesn't have the bank account at the Canadian bank, or might be a sort of additional barrier, because they will say, okay, we'll pay. We don't want to consider even to change the currency for the transactions.
But they won't. They won't. They're going to ask you for. They're going to ask you for an invoice in Canadian dollar that you will do. They will send you Canadian dollar. When it gets to your bank will make the conversion into euros onto your account in Europe. That's it. But if you start to have a lot of business with Canada and you want to manage your exchange rate a bit better, what you can do is you can open a Canadian dollar bank account in Europe. So with your European bank, you can have a bank account in Canadian dollars, and then you just manage whenever it makes sense for you. Because, you know, the thing is you can bill in Canadian dollars, and then let's say you have to pay someone in Canada to do the installation of your product. Well, you don't want to convert the money in euro and convert it again in Canadian dollar, because you're going to lose money for sure. So you keep some money on that account in Canadian dollars. You pay what you have to pay, the expense and so on. And when that's done, you convert it back in euro. Clear. There are some very great system now, like I don't know if you know about that, TransferWise and others, and you just open, like for my company Adexia, most of the time I will invoice my clients in euro, and so we have bank account. I think it's in Belgium. I mean, with Wise, they open it wherever it's easier for them. And then we get paid in euro in that account. We pay what we have to pay in Europe with that money. And whenever the exchange is favorable, we bring it back to Canada. Okay, clear. Thank you. I don't think the currency is actually really an issue. So now, and that's always a big question, what are the payment period in Canada? So it's typically 30 days, but when it comes to working with the government, you have to be a bit careful and make sure that's clearly stated in your offer and in the contract you have with the government. So IP, we talked about it before. I mentioned it was something you had to be very careful with. Please keep in mind that Canada is part of a few international agreements. So for trademark, it's the Madrid Protocol, and so on and so on. But yes, just make sure you do a diligent work at making sure that whatever you sell in Canada is well protected in terms of IP in general, patent, industrial design, name. The branding is actually protecting your name is very important, because we've seen some story where someone worked with a distributor in Canada, and the distributor realized that worked for a few years building the name, the brand. They realize that the name is not protected, and so therefore they're the ones that deposit the name, because they consider that they've done all the work at developing the name in the country. So it's pretty borderline, but it happened in some cases, and so again, you better be well protected before. So those are IP convention. Not much to comment on that. But if deposit some specific IP in Canada, you must use an IP agent. There are people who are specialized into doing that and do that all day long, and it's a real subject. Employers and employee. I think what here is important to understand is the relation between employer and employee, which is with the hierarchy, which is much flatter than it can be in many places in Europe. There is typically a quite direct relation between a manager and his team, or even the manager and his team and a level below. It's pretty much the policy of open doors. Yeah, typically employees can have quite an easy access to their not only manager, but N+1, N+2, N+3. What has to be, and I think which will potentially apply here, if you work with some subcontractors, you have to be careful that you don't fall in a situation where the contractor works solely for you, and then you're in the situation where it becomes considered as being an employee of your company. You have to be careful with that. You have to be careful also on the fact that, let's say you don't create a subsidiary and you find a partner in Canada and you employ them full-time, that it's not considered that you're trying to go around the system and that those people should be employed by you, but you've decided to ask someone to create a company to employ them. So all those mechanisms, I think you have the same in Europe, where they want to protect employees, but they will also to make sure they collect all the taxes they have to collect.
Jan, sorry, we have a question in chat. I don't know if you have access to chat.
No, I don't see it.
Okay, because Mary Hadidi from Cluster Lumiere is asking if you could send or provide also maybe on Thursday more information or websites for the IP management in Canada.
Sure.
So how to protect it in Canada, how to check if the IP is recognized, the one that we have, or how to check if somebody is maybe using the similar products, and how to maybe register the Canadian IP.
Yeah, again, I think the best way to do it will be to go through an AP agent, but I will definitively send you the link for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I noticed now here that there is like forcing in the chat, but actually I can
We are managing the chat, don't worry.
Okay, good. So what else? So typically 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, 2 weeks of vacations. So don't fall off your chairs like in Europe, but that's the norm here when you start. But people tend to move rapidly to 3 weeks, but a lot of people only have 3 weeks of vacation per year. So that's one of the big difference. As we're talking about that, maybe I'd like to open a parenthesis on the difficulty right now in Canada to find some human resources. The labor market is very tense. It's quite a challenge to find people. I think in Europe you have a little bit of the same situation, but I'm not sure it's to the same extent, which I believe is actually an opportunity for some European companies, because there is some activities here where even through public procurement, and some people are going through public procurement because, let's say, they want to do a development on a development on the software, and it can't find the resource internally, so they will go through tender and to find someone to contract that to. But right now, to find developers in Canada is a very big challenge. So, you know, that's where you can sometimes find opportunities because you have maybe a little bit more labor available. You know, I had discussion with a company from Brazil, for example. In Brazil, they have a ton of labor available, and they have some people who are well trained to develop software, and so they're positioning themselves now in Canada, saying that not only it's available, but on top of it, it's cheaper to develop it in Brazil than it is in Canada. So, you know, look also at that. Sometimes at that way, which is a little bit different approach, but that's always an interesting perspective. Another thing that I've seen lately and discussion with my clients is because again, I know in Europe also it's a little bit difficult not only to find people, but to keep people. You know, Canada is always quite attractive for younger people and people coming out of school and they want to do the experience, and Montreal, Toronto are nice places to be. And I've seen quite a number of companies that have incorporated creating a subsidiary in Canada as part of their labor force retaining strategy, because they offer it in part of the development plan for the new employees to say during the process of the next 3 years, we offer you to go spend 1 or 2 years in our subsidiary in Canada. And that's something that, you know, can work quite well. And during the time the people are here in Canada, they are pretty loyal, and because of the way the work permit are structured, they cannot just, you know, change employers while they're in Canada. Well, except if they go back to Europe, but if they stay here, they're going to have to be loyal for you to the time of their work permit. So interesting strategies that have been deployed by a few of my clients to not only offer it as an opportunity for something new, but also to retain people and kind of get kind of the insurance that they will stay on your payroll for the time they're being overseas. What else should I say about employer-employee? Yes, in terms of, so if you start working there, open a subsidiary and start hiring people, again, because it's a pretty tense labor market, salary is not enough anymore. And where employees see value in Canada, it's, well, in the salary, obviously, but also in all the perks that are going around it, especially everything related to health insurance coverage. So in Canada, we have a universal health coverage. So if you go to the doctor, to the hospital, it's free. But if you go to the dentist, if you go to the eye doctor, if you go to some specific procedures, it's not free anymore. And health benefit become potentially very expensive. And therefore, being able to offer that to your employees is a big plus in your capacity to retain them on payroll. And then you can have all other mechanisms around pension plan and so on. Yeah, 59% of Canadians have graduated from post-secondary institutions. I think that's a pretty impressive number. So the level of education in Canada is pretty good. You can expect to find people with a pretty decent level of education, especially in a technical field. So that's yeah, something to always take into consideration if you are in a more technical type of product. You know, I mentioned at the very beginning that Canada was built on immigration, has been built and is being built on immigration. One of the things you have to understand is that it's a selective immigration. And therefore, in Canada, they only bring people that they need. So right now, if we need 50,000 developers, they're going to bring people that have training or an education in software development. So it's very, very selective, and it's based on the actual needs of the country. So tax incentive, Canada has one specifically strong program for tax incentive, which is what we call the SHRED. So it's basically research and development, where you can have a tax credit. So every time you can demonstrate that you're doing some R&D, all those amounts can be put against a tax credit. Now, to be able to have access to that SHRED program, obviously you need to have a subsidiary in Canada and to have the expense made in Canada. But again, if you're in the logic of developing here and you want to have some activity in Canada, that's something to definitely take into consideration, because it's a pretty good program. Maybe another point is that Canada is very well organized when it comes to Economic Development Agency. So you will find a lot of different support in all the different regions of Canada of people from the different level of government, especially at the provincial level. But also at the municipal level, we'll try to help you and give you not financial incentive, but give you support to help you establish in their territory. But it's very well organized, very well mapped across Canada. So those are people that can always help you in the process. Culture and practices in businesses, I think that will, to some extent, apply to the tenders. In Europe, we tend to make things always a little bit overly complicated, overly intellectual, I will say, when in Canada and North America in general, it's way more practical. And so basically, the reason why I'm saying that is, especially if you have a tender and that tender asks you to measure the intensity of light in the street, well, if the tender asks you to measure the level of intensity of the light in the street, bring them a product that measures the level of intensity of the light in the street, but they don't need to have the level of noise, they don't need to have the level of humidity, they don't need the level of everything. Like it's kind of my experience is that a lot of companies in Europe also try to be very refined, very overdeveloped in the product, in the offer. Here, if they ask you for the product to do A, make the product do A, or answer to the tender with a product that does A. Because if it does A, B, C, D, it's nice. But if it makes your product 25% more expensive, it's not nice anymore because you won't be selected. So stay with the program. If the tender is very specific, also be very specific in your answer, and also make sure you cover what needs to be covered. And if you have extra, well, if it's at no extra cost, why not? If it's at extra cost, forget about it. Well, for the rest, I guess it's a bit later in the relation, but in terms of, sorry. Yeah, in terms of way to talk to people, you know, it's common sense. in Canada, people don't like conflict too much. They will rather avoid conflict as much as possible. So if you have negotiation, discussion, try to be on the gentle side and try to resolve the issue, but avoiding direct confrontation as much as possible. One thing very important, and I think in Europe it's very different from one country to the next, but for sure in Canada, jokes and humor, please walk away from anything kind of sexist or political. That's not going to be working very well. Yeah, just something to keep in mind. Yeah, I don't think there's much to cover on. So yeah, that's something that's very important, I think. You know, I mentioned people avoid confrontation here in Canada, and that's reflecting in business development. So, you know, when you try to reach someone, first of all, and especially since COVID, email is 100% preferred over phone. Reaching someone by phone is quite a challenge. There is still a lot of people who are working from home. They typically don't share their private number, and they only sometimes share their cell phone. So reaching someone by phone is a bit challenging. But even pre-COVID, email was always preferred in Canada in terms of discussion. And I think it's because it's easier for them to ignore an email than to ignore a phone call when they're not interested. And so there is a natural enthusiasm in Canada when you talk to someone. So you present your product and people are going, oh, that's wonderful. They are rarely going to say your product makes no sense, okay? So they're going to tell you, oh, that's wonderful. I think that would be a great fit for what we need. I'm going to look into that with our team, but I think we're going to order your product. So you go out of the meeting, you go back to Europe, and you're like, oh, wow, that was such a great meeting I had with those people. They're going to order some product. Guys, you can start producing. And then you send an email as a follow-up. Hey, thank you, that was a great meeting. So what's the next step? How should we start working together? And then silence. So keep in mind that's just the way of people are here in Canada. They're always going to be very enthusiastic about whatever you offer them, but it doesn't mean that they're really interested. The real way to measure that they have a real interest is that if they start answering your emails and questions. If they don't, most of the time, they will rather not answer than say no. And that's very frustrating, especially in some cultures in Europe where people are used to have an answer and are used to push commercially until you have an answer. You can waste a lot of resource and energy here in Canada doing so. Now, this being said, it's also a way, and we were talking about that before, how do I show I'm committed? How do I show I want to enter that market and I'm serious about that market? It's also a way for them to test you and, you know, make sure that after one email you don't give up, but that you really want and you're really serious about developing here. And so they're going to make you suffer a little bit before they accept to talk to you again and consider that you're being serious.
Yeah, this applies, does it apply also to the public officials? So if, for example, is it common or is it acceptable to contact them directly? Let's say to have some information maybe on the projects, investments, or how they are planning if they have any lighting strategy at the municipal level or something, or if having more information on the public procurement. And highlighting that maybe you're interested to apply, but you have difficulties in reaching I don't know, the portals. So is it normal practice, or they will just, I don't know.
So there are two different periods. Before and after a tender and during a tender. So as you can imagine, during a tender, the people who are carrying that tender are not allowed to communicate with everybody and to give any information outside of the defined process.